Welcome to More Than a Muse podcast. My name is Sadie.
I'm Stauney, and happy 2025.
Happy 2025. We are so back, and I'm so excited to be back.
Same, me too. I think our last episode was October,
Yep.
I guess first week of November. So it's been a while, but we're excited to be here, excited to get back into the groove of it all.
We were talking about it before we started recording that we feel a little bit rusty.
Mhm.
So bear with us. If there's maybe one too many like or ums this episode, we are working on being podcasters again.
It's like we've completely forgotten all of our skills.
I couldn't even figure out how to set up my camera and ring light before we started
doing great.
here. But I'm excited to start up the year, and it feels funny to start the new year with an episode about a vampire movie.
I know.
But we both saw it and it felt right.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it just seemed like something we wanted to talk about. So I was like, might as well, because this is our podcast.
And we make the rules. I mean, I guess the reason why we have this podcast is because this was naturally what we were talking about before. Because just the way that you text me, like, you have to see this movie, the feminist themes. Wait a minute. What if we just talk about it on our podcast? What we organically talk about, let's make it the episode. So it works out great.
Plus, I feel like there's been some weird discourse around this movie.
Yeah.
I saw a thread that someone was like, attention all women, do not go see Nosferatu. You'll thank me later.
Interesting.
And I was like, what?
Why? What was the reasoning?
They didn't give any trigger warning. Some people in the comments were talking about how they felt like it was a glorified sexual assault movie. And I was like, well, it's a vampire movie. I don't think anyone willingly gets their blood sucked most of the time. So there is an inherent predator prey type.
Totally. And the whole point is Nosferatu is the villain.
Yeah. But then I get he's a different kind of villain than a regular monster movie as well. There's a lot of nuance to this film.
Yeah.
But I thought the director did an incredible job with taking kind of the genre of the final girl, as you call it, or the heroine, and then making it feel more like a fully fleshed out character.
Yes.
And I know that's something we'll talk about with the original Nosferatu versus this, because it's technically a remake, even though the other one was a silent film from the 20s.
A total ripoff from Dracula.
Yes. Which is the whole thing. But I think he did incredible. And I've heard that he does a lot of films like this, that this is something that he does frequently. I'm going to say his name.
Oh, yeah. Shout out the director.
Robert Eggers.
Yes.
I don't know. I thought it was great. I walked out and I was like, that was so feminist.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So I didn't feel that way, but I get how it could maybe be triggering.
I mean, it's 100% it's an uncomfortable movie. They don't shy away from anything I don't know. It's unsettling, the ending. Spoiler alert, because we're going to talk about how this movie ends.
I was going to say, if you are planning on seeing this movie, do not listen to this episode until after you've seen it. But if you're not planning on seeing it, if it's just not your thing, then of course you're welcome to listen to the discourse on it. Yeah. But if you do enjoy spooky or intense movies, 100% please go watch this movie. But yeah, we will be spoiling this 100%.
Another thing too, when I walked out of the movie, I was like, ugh, why did they make it end like that? That was dumb. But then after I was Googling on the way home, and that's how the original movie ends.
Yeah.
It's because it was a remake. He remade the movie and he paid a really amazing tribute to the source material. He wasn't going to make any major changes. And so once I understood that and then learned about what those small, subtle differences that he did make from the original movie, it did make me appreciate his direction even more.
That final scene too has so many references back to Renaissance art and even medieval, and I was stunned by the final scene. But then I remember, I think I even said to Mo as we were walking out, I was like, why did he have to be so ugly?
Yeah.
But then I thought about it more and I was like, no, that's the point. Yeah, we'll also talk about that. I feel like we have a tendency as a society to really romanticize the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the fact that they didn't try to do that at all.
Yeah, because Twilight is one example, but we very much sexified vampires. They're the sexy villain, even when they're not like the good vampires. Even the bad ones, there's like a sexiness to it. And yeah, I agree. I think it helped the point of the movie that they made him a horrible, disgusting monster and not human-like.
That's even the original Dracula. In the book, he's described as basically like a walking corpse, skin and bones barely hanging on because they're dead. And yet that wasn't even seen in the original Dracula film. They made him this suave, like a widow's peak vampire that's turned into a whole genre of like vampire films where he's like this hero. So so it's nice to see them stepping back to that and being like, no, this man is disgusting.
He is a monster that kills people. Nothing's romantic about that.
No, like he is gross and they're not shying away from that at all. So they're not trying to make him more than he is. He's
a monster. And this is what monsters look like. I'm going to just jump in and talk a little bit about the original and then talk about some key differences. And then I know afterwards we're going to talk about some feminist themes throughout it. Like you mentioned, Nosferatu was a 1922 silent film that was a German silent film directed by F.W. Marnow with a screenplay by Henry Galeen. Max Schreck was Count Orlok, which is instead of Count Dracula, it's Count Orlok. And he is a vampire who preys on the wife of his estate agent and basically brings a plague to their town. About the making of this film is that it was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. A lot of names and details were changed. Like I mentioned, instead of Count Dracula, it was Count Orlok, but it's Dracula. It's 100% just the plot of Dracula.
He took some liberties, but
there were some liberties, but it is essentially more or less the plot of Dracula.
Yeah.
And because of this, there was a copyright infringement accusations. And also another thing, because I guess originally the title screen in the silent film said inspired by Dracula. So when it came to deny it, they didn't really have any.
It was some
Dracula
art.
Yeah. They changed his name.
Let him make their fan art.
And that's another thing that's interesting to think about is because now, like we mentioned, vampires are like such a baseline thing in culture. Like so many vampire movies, TV shows, books. But it was so new with Dracula that you can't just make a vampire movie casually when the one book is Dracula.
Yeah.
It's just copying. It wasn't such a main.
Also think the word like Nosferatu came from the text of Dracula. It was like a word that they used in the book, like talking about something to do with vampires. And so they like pulled it right from there. And even though his name is like Count Orlok, Nosferatu becomes like his mythical name.
Yeah, unfortunately, there was no diet here. But it was basically a more low budget film that was made by Germans for German audiences. They set it in Germany. They're German named. So even with all the details that were slightly altered, Bram Stoker's widow actually sued over the adaptation's copyright violation, and a court ruled that all of the copies of the film be destroyed. However, of course, several prints of this movie did survive, and it went on to become considered a influential masterpiece of horror genre cinema.
And now you can watch the whole thing on YouTube.
Hey, good to know. I should go back and watch it.
Yeah, I didn't sit down and watch the whole thing. I was like, I'm not in the mood for a silent film. No offense to the genre.
I think that's very valid.
Yeah, but I did watch like a video where they recapped the original silent film and showed scenes from it and everything. And it was during that era when they did a lot of like overreactions. So for some reason, like the husband in it is like laughing all the time. He's like, I don't know.
Amazing.
But yeah, you can find the whole thing online for sure, even though it was supposed to be gone. So sorry, Bram Stoker.
Something that I thought was interesting that just provides some context is that this movie was made right after World War One. And a lot of the people that were involved in this movie either fought directly in World War One or had family members that did. Talked about how like a lot of the themes were like regarding fear of quote unquote the other. Some people have noted that there's even like anti-Semitic undertones to this movie.
I didn't feel like there was in the remake.
No, definitely not in the remake, but in the original movie.
Yeah.
Others have said, no, the director didn't do any of that on purpose. who's to say? But from a certain lens, you can maybe look at that and wonder if those kind of like messaging was being said in the original movie, or if it was just general, just fear of wartime and this uncertain time that they were in.
War makes people crazy.
Something that I thought was cool too in the movie that is a little bit different, I think, than the original Dracula book, is that there was a lot more like mysticism and magic. Count Orlok is like a son of created by a demon or something like that.
Okay.
Let me just read this whole quote before I butcher it. But so it's by Law Eisner, who said, mysticism and magic, the dark forces to which Germans have always been more than willing to commit themselves, had flourished in the face of the death on the battlefields. These forces were intrinsic to the shaping of cinema's first vampire. And then, quote, this monstrous event that is unleashed across the earth like a cosmic vampire to drink the blood of millions and millions of men, which is something that one of the people in the movie talked about, like linking war and vampires. I think it's Belial or like Belial, who is a term occurring in the Bible that's like basically like a personification of the devil. He's linked between war and contagion. And then Orlok is linked to the Black Death. And I'm pretty sure like the origins of him is like he's like a creation of Belial. Nosferatu, people think that like he's bringing this disease-bearing rodents that brings this sickness that like plagues this entire town. People associate that with like trench warfare, where like rats flourish and everything like that. So I just thought that was interesting of like the connection between war and vampires and then the eventual creation of this movie. So then as for like some differences between these movies, the main difference I think, and the reason why I like this movie, was the way that Ellen, who is the woman, is portrayed in this movie. And like I said, the plot line is more or less the same, but he makes such subtle changes to the character as well as to like just small little plot lines that help Lisa make her a such more well-rounded character that I thought was super interesting. So in the 1922 version of Ellen, so she's the new wife of Hutter, who spends her time playing with kittens and mourning the death of freshly cut flowers. And she's devastated when her husband embarks on a business trip to the castle of Count Orlok and is basically just so sad and stares off at the sea. And the theme is that like the corruption of this virtuous woman becomes the vampire's like true threat. And the men in her life will do anything to prevent him from like corrupting this virtuous woman. The wives are definitely like extensions of their husbands rather than characters themselves. They are punished for existing. Basically what happens in the original silent film is that Count Orlok just sees a picture, the locket of his estate manager's wife, and becomes very transfixed with her, and then goes off and then goes and finds her. Like it's almost like a unfortunate chance that he happens to see this.
Okay.
Whereas in this new movie, she is a very like spiritually touched person. It talks about how like she had visions as a kid and she could predict her Christmas presents and things like that. That she was the one who opened up this relationship with Count Orlok as a younger person. And like maybe some people would look at that and be like, oh, so it's her fault that the evil is here. It's her fault this and this. But I think it made her so much more like a main character in her own life, you know, than just making her victim on the side.
Yeah. And like it's important to know like she was trying to establish a connection with something in the beyond, but like she asked for like an angel. Like and then he took advantage of that and then started this whole thing and basically became obsessed with her. She is like the whole reason that her husband travels and the plague comes and everything. But yeah, definitely different from just, oh, I accidentally saw your photo and thought you were beautiful, and that was that.
Yeah. She is a very spiritually gifted person, and then she knows from the beginning, no, you can't leave, something bad will happen. And her husband doesn't listen to her because he's like, no, I want to take care of you. I want all of these things for you. Which I'm sure there's an argument that if he would have listened to her and not gone away, that none of the events of the movie would have happened, because in her husband, she had found this safe place in this refuge, and Count Orlok couldn't hurt her, essentially.
Yeah. Or would he have just used someone else? Because he was so set and obsessed with her. So yeah, it's interesting. Like you can't really blame him either for it, but...
And that's another thing too that I actually really liked is like the way that they demonstrated the relationship, because she very genuinely feels like that it was like the love of her husband that is what like drew her out of the vampire's grip. And I think that they did a really good job. Like, I really felt that she loved him and that it wasn't a toxic thing per se. You know, like he was a flawed husband, but I don't think that he was like an evil, controlling. They genuinely seemed to really love one another.
Oh, definitely.
And sure, he dismissed her in like parts where like he didn't listen to her and went along on this business trip, but like in a real life scenario, like I would maybe understand why I'd be like, no, don't worry, you're just gonna miss me, don't worry, I'll be fine.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But I did like their relationship, actually.
I did too. I thought they did a really good job of that. You're rooting for them, and every time she's conscious, she's thinking of Thomas. Actually. Yeah, she goes back to him over and over again, and you could argue everything she does ends up being for him. Yeah, they definitely got that there.
Totally. And I love this quote that says, Eggers allows Ellen to be a complete human being rather than a dehumanized female prize or leverage in a sinister struggle for power. Even in the grips of his depravity, Orlok needs her willing consent to consummate their unholy union. No longer an extension of her husband's house and a tangible measurement of his injury, Ellen is the key to Orlok's undoing. The hideous count gives her 3 nights to renounce her love for Thomas and return to their dark compact, threatening her loved ones if she does not agree. And then, desperate to save Thomas, Ellen conspires with Franz, who's like a scientist, to offer herself to the beast and then distract him with her blood until the first morning's light. So both versions of the film do require like some type of female sacrifice, but this version, I think, gave her a little bit more agency and empowerment as opposed to the original, where she is just like this victim of chance, essentially, and sacrifices herself. Whereas like with this, like she's wrestling morally. This is my fault. What did I do? I think she's so much more of like just a real person of like trying to face this, but then realizing in the end that unfortunately this is the only thing to do. There's even a moment where she's like questioning herself, where she says if evil comes from within or beyond, talking about like her feelings of attack. But there's a moment where he like talks about whether man or women, we all have darkness lurking in the recesses of our heart. It's only by confronting our sins and imperfections that we can find the strength to drive them out and combat evil from a place of understanding.
Which was beautiful.
Yeah.
That moment in the movie, I was like, that is such a good quote. It's only by first recognizing the darkness within yourself that you're able to combat it, because you're able to understand it, so then you're able to destroy it.
We've talked about it previously when we've talked about women psychopaths, you know, of like this unwillingness almost to like view women as like true villains or like capable of wrongdoing, and how in a way that's like the other end of the spectrum of like you put women on too much of a pedestal and then they're not real people at all. And I think it, like I said, it helped her be a fully realized human being that was able to then make that choice that she was going to sacrifice herself in order to stop this monster.
Definitely. There's like a Pinterest quote that I see all the time that's very wonderful though. And it talks about, it's like a dialogue, I think, between a man and a woman. But she says, I think every woman relates to Persephone. And he was like, for what? For falling in love with someone terrible or whatever? And then she goes, no, for having a little bit of light and darkness inside us at the same time.
Totally.
And I was like, I think that's something that this movie did. Like, the main message I think I got from it more than anything is like, they didn't force Ellen to be like all good or like all evil. She was just human. I think she was the most human heroine we've had in a very long time.
Yeah.
Where she recognized that she had darkness within her, and yet she hadn't done anything wrong her whole life. She hadn't sinned or anything by their standards. She had never done anything truly awful. She just knew that part of her true nature wasn't entirely what society viewed as good.
Yeah.
And then that's why his quote is even more important. That's by recognizing within herself, she was finally able to conquer Nosferatu.
It made me appreciate this movie so much more when I had the original to compare it to, because I was able to see those subtle changes that he did make, and it made her character just so much more interesting than just some hopeless victim.
Oh, definitely. He did such a good job with her.
Really?
And Lily Rose Depp did amazing. Like,
oh my gosh. Okay. My favorite thing that I think I've seen about this, because you know that TV show The Idol that she was in?
Oh, yeah.
That was done by the same guy who did Euphoria, Sam Levinson. I think that's how you say his last name. And
who like is not
yeah, I just don't
I just feel
trust
like
it.
Kind of sucks.
Yeah, and that's the exact thing that I saw, because that TV show did not do very well.
Mm-hmm.
And people were like, what a relief. Now we know it wasn't Lily Rose Depp's fault. It was, we can blame that all on Sam Levinson.
Yes, it was like, no, she can do it.
She was incredible.
She was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
100% the idol was not on her.
No, and I think the scene that just gives me the most chills when I think back on is like that moment when her and Thomas are like talking right before they like decide to go fight him, when he comes back from the vampire, and like she admits basically everything that happened. And she goes from like light to dark, where she's like, oh, you never satisfied me. Like he could, like being vile and scary, but then almost like immediately switching back and being like, no, this is actually what's happening. And I think that like seeing the duality of both sides of her in that moment, it was the scariest part of the film for me.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. It was so refreshing. Like, yeah, in so many ways, like a complex female character. Thank you. Oh, we can handle it. It's one of those movies that you can't just go and watch and then leave. It's one of those movies that's supposed to make you think about it. And you have to realize it's coming from an 1800 year old text from Dracula. The themes are a little bit different from I think what we're used to. But yeah, I was like, it's not necessarily a movie that's, oh, that's so fun. It's like, no, it's not like, oh, but that was like really important and beautiful in so many ways. I think it'll be polarizing. Should we talk about some of the symbolism of it all?
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear about the Renaissance, like parallels.
Yes. We will get to that in just a second. I wanted to talk about a few things that I just loved that I thought was different from what you usually see in the horror genre, and especially with like monster movies. One thing I loved, and I brought up immediately that I even think the original text has, is the fact that Ellen's not a virgin.
Yeah.
And yet she's able to be offered as the sacrifice in the end. And I just loved
like, it's such a subtle change, but I think it's so important. Yeah.
It's so wonderful. They even call her like a maiden of pure intentions or whatever.
Heart, I think,
yeah. And it's because it's not reducing your entire level of like holiness down to whether or not you've had sex.
Yeah.
I just thought that was such an important thing, that she's married. Her and Thomas have consummated their relationship. They've been married for a while. But that doesn't change the fact that she was like a maiden holy without sin. So he put more value on her as a person and her actual actions and doings than just her virginity.
Yeah.
Which, if you think of, that's such a big trope. Like even in Hocus Pocus, it's like a virgin that has to light the candle. Yeah. And that's a kid's movie. It's just like a constant thing that happens in so many tropes, that it's like always a virgin. And even when we talked about horror movies, that it's always the people that have sex that die.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just thought it was nice to see that, where the heroine of the film isn't hanging on to her virginity in that way that so many force them to. And then also, the agency that she's given from Franz and Thomas and even Nosferatu, that the choice is there at all times. And her consent was a part of the contract. Because even Count Orlok, he's like, no, you can't kidnap her and bring her to me unwillingly. She has to like agree to this. Yeah.
Which, like, granted, he was saying, or I'll kill your family and everyone you love, but
it's still under duress. But her being willing had to be like a part of it, which is nice as well. And then also, like, I already talked about it, but like her being able to embrace the duality of herself in the end. Some other things, like her relationship with Count Orlok has a lot of nuance. And I think that's something that people have had the most discourse about, because I've seen a lot of people that are like, Count Orlok goes on the hear me out cake. Or they're falling for the really ugly man and no one can tell you otherwise. And treating Count Orlok and Ellen as like the true lovers of the film. And I'm like, I don't think that's right. Yeah. And I think you have to look at it in the terms of their relationship, where it's like he came to her when she was younger asking for help and companionship. Yeah. And then basically told her over and over again, you're not of this world. You don't belong here. Like, you belong with me. Like, you're not human enough to be here.
Which is like textbook grooming of like you going to a younger person being like, oh yeah, you are special. You are different. You're mature for your age. Yes. All of those things.
Yeah, it's textbook grooming. But then he made her feel connected and gave her kind of what she was desiring. And then she feels confused because the desires aren't bad. And the connection that you want to have with another person isn't bad, but he's not a good person.
Yeah.
So it shows that whole thing. And then I saw someone else talking about the fact that Thomas is that second relationship safe place that a lot of people find when they've been victims of abuse like that, that they're able to find someone who isn't taking advantage of them and doesn't try to make them feel othered in any way. And so how that kind of parallels, and then him coming back to haunt her later because she's happy.
Yeah,
and how
exactly.
that kind of ends up in there
and
too.
And she talks about how it's like he comes back because he found out she was married is the thing. It's like now he knows that she's happy and settled.
Yeah, so he has to return and ruin it for her. And yeah, but I don't think the love story of it is Orlok and Ellen. And I think that would be completely unfair to say. It's the things that she felt and like even desired from Orlok aren't necessarily anything to do with him. It's just like parts of you that like it gets complicated because someone introduced it to you who's like not a good person. So yeah, so I thought that was more interesting and has a lot more nuance to it than I think people are getting. And then the fate of her friend Anna and her husband.
Yes.
I thought was a really interesting parallel that I haven't seen a lot of people talking about. I saw one comment where it was like the ending scene between Anna and her husband echoes the ending scene of the movie, just from a different angle.
Oh, cool.
And then something in me clicked and I was like, oh my gosh, Anna's husband took advantage of his wife the same way that Nosferatu took advantage of Ellen. Not exactly in the same way because he didn't groom her or anything, but he hates Ellen because she brings in different stuff to their house that he's not comfortable with. But then also the way he kept saying, I can't resist my wife. And I think it was like supposed to be cute, but then after she's dead, he's, oh, I can't resist you. And ends up like taking advantage of her in her death, which is showing the parallel of Nosferatu feeling like he can't resist Ellen to the point where he destroys her. And how that shows the same thing, that like he's just as much as a monster as Nosferatu because he did it to his own family. So I thought that was an interesting thing the director showed, that kind of shows that the monster can come from different forms. And like a controlling husband is just as bad as like a grooming predator. Yeah. So
interesting.
And then just the thing that she's able to do at the end with Nosferatu constantly telling her she's not of this world, she's not for humanity, she doesn't belong with them. But then at the end, she chooses to save Thomas because that's who was going to die if she didn't go. It would be Thomas. And also like the village from the plague. She's choosing her humanity over her connection to the other realm, to any mysticism, to Nosferatu. She picks them. And and that's like a repeating thing that they showed, that every time she came out of like her trances or her seizures or anything, she would immediately think of Thomas or like her friend. Like her connection to the world was always there after whatever had happened with the Beyond. That was super interesting. And then also I thought it was important, someone mentioned that Nosferatu even calls himself just an appetite, like not even a person.
Oh.
And I think that helps if you look at it too, where it's like she doesn't like him for being him. It's more like the appeal of an appetite.
I saw
like
this
the need for something.
This tweet that someone made about the reason why she thinks Nosferatu is so ugly is because it's the personification of how Ellen views her own desires. And
I like that.
She would have to, it'd have to be ugly because those natural desires that aren't inherently bad, but if you've been conditioned and shamed into thinking that that is bad, that is how you would actually view it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a cool way to view that.
Beyond sex too. It was her connection to anything. She didn't feel like she was able to have any of her spiritual stuff at all without,
like she knew that was going to make her an other, and so anything that was associated with that was something to be ashamed of.
It was literally like all of her true natures and desires and appetites like all brought into that. Yes, that was super interesting. Okay, and then final scene.
Yeah.
The final scene is they pan out and Ellen has collapsed on the bed because she's dead, because Nosferatu drank all of her blood. And she actually, for the last, I loved this, she turns her head and looks at Thomas as he comes in the door. And that's when she dies, is like looking at him.
Like she gets to see him one last time.
Yes. And then Nosferatu is basically turned into a skeleton because the sun has rised. And I also realized that's the first time you see like sunlight in the entire movie.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Like they didn't have any warm sunlight the entire time. So that's the first time you see it. And then the screen pans up over them and you see Ellen laying there with like blood all around her and her head is turned. And then on top of her, covering her, is this skeleton of this vampire and who is a full-on skeleton. And then the one guy starts spreading lavender everywhere and then it ends. And this was intentional by the director to be a scene replicating a common motif called Death in the Maiden, which notably is a German motif. And it was seen in Renaissance art a lot, especially in German painting and printmaking. And it's just two figures with a young woman being seized by a personification of death, which is often shown as a skeleton.
Wow.
Yes. And variants include other figures. There's a lot of different ones that have been depicted or seen since then. Some people do more of like a Grim Reaper type death, but it was developed from the Danse Macabre and had an erotic subtext, so very fitting for this film. And the German artist Hans Baldung himself depicted it several times. One of the other things about it is that it got really revived during the Romantic era, and Franz Schubert even turned it into a song, Der Tod und das Mädchen. I'm not sure I'm saying that right.
Death and the Maiden.
Yes. Setting a poem by the German poet Matthias Claudius to music for that song. And then part of the piano part was reused in his famous string quartet number 14.
Wow.
So it's a very powerful, enduring symbol in art, literature, and cultural history that kind of just shows the vitality and beauty of a young woman, which is very valued in our society, next to the inevitability and finality of death, which continues to relate with us in every period we live in.
Yeah.
That's a thing. There's a lot of representations of this. Like I mentioned, you've got the whole like youth and mortality contrast of youth and life and everything, and then death as the skeleton. There's also the idea of eros and thanatos, which is love and death, which intertwines sexuality and death, which drives drawing on the Freudian concept of eros, the life drive, and thanatos, the death drive, which I thought was also extremely interesting in the context of this film.
Yeah.
Because the maiden can represent sexual awakening or innocence, while death signifies the ultimate end, which creates the tension between, obviously, sexuality is how life is created.
Yeah.
And then death is how life is destroyed. They're the
kind of
perfect
at odds.
opposites.
Yeah.
And then also, obviously, you have innocence and corruption, and power dynamics is another important part of it. Because death is this dominating force.
It literally takes us all at one point.
Yes. But then you also have the maiden confronting that with agency. Like you can get away from death in a lot of ways by the choices you make. And then also just like transformation and redemption. In some interpretations, the maiden's encounter with death signifies like a transformation from life to the afterlife, from innocence to knowledge, and also the connotation that like death allows freedom from like earthly struggles. Yeah, it's like a very common motif. And I was like blown away by that. And I was like, that is absolutely beautiful how they were able to do that for the ending scene and how many things that has with it. Because yeah, it's been seen throughout time. There's medieval and Renaissance art that has it called the memento mori, reminder of death. Romanticism, it became a very seductive, mysterious, romanticized notion of death, of course, as we've talked about so much.
Oh, and Victorian era.
Gothic and Victorian era, they 100% explored that one, especially with themes of sexual repression, societal norms, existential dread. Also, Victorian representations started shedding light on vulnerability of woman and the inevitability of death. You also think about during that time period when we talked about the Gothic and Victorian era, how many women died in childbirth, and just the mortality in general of everyone was so aware at that time. And then in modern and contemporary uses, it of course continues to appear also in just art, film, literature, more likely with a feminist lens now, and critiquing the objectification of women exploring female agency and confronting death, which is 100% in this one. She makes the final choice. Death isn't just something that happens to her. It's something that she takes on in order to save her people and her husband. And then it's also used to highlight the relationship between beauty, power, and mortality and how they all tap in to each other. And there's just a lot of things in there, like fear of death, yearning for immortality, and most importantly, the duality of our existence. It's the interplay of opposites, life and death, beauty and decay, innocence and corruption, the human experience.
Just to tie it all up nicely with the bow.
Yeah, and like that really is what it is in the end of the day. Like death in the Maiden, that ending scene of Nosferatu, it's like your appetites and your choices and your decisions. That's all a part of who you are. That's what makes up all of us. We all have the Maiden and death essentially within us at all times.
Goodness.
Yeah.
So cool to, realize how just ever present that trope has been, especially like in little German culture. Man, it's almost like life imitates art, imitates life, imitates art, and so on and so forth.
Yes, 100%. They did such a good job.
Yeah. I think, like I said, this is a movie that the more I think about it and the more I learn about the movie, the more I like it, which I think is a good sign about a movie.
And also on top of that, every single shot in this movie could be a framed painting.
Truly. Like when you brought up the fact that the lighting of it wasn't warm until the end, there's part of me that's, wait, but wasn't that whole movie in black and white? Because the way they colored it so intentionally, sometimes it almost felt like a black and white film.
Oh, yeah.
But like it just showed like the way they were coloring it, like they captured the vibe. That's for
they
sure.
Did so good. Yeah, it's gonna stick with me for a long time. I've been thinking about it more and more, and it just builds. There's so many Reddit threads about it if you want to dive into people's different interpretations. But yeah, I just feel like it would be a disservice to first off say that like Nosferatu is the love interest. 100% not.
Gross.
Yeah, he's disgusting. But that's the point of the film. And then don't discount Thomas and Ellen's love. They're the true love story.
That's what I think. Actually, I do think it's so sweet. And I don't know, part of me is that a toxic thing? Like how much I was obsessed with their relationship? But
I don't think so.
The point of the movie was that you wanted to root for them.
Yeah, like they were willing to do absolutely anything for each other. Like even on Thomas's side, like once he realizes what's going on.
Like he was willing to sacrifice himself.
Oh yeah, he left before he was healed. They were like, "Oh, you're not completely
He had to get back
good."
to her because he knew finally he was like, "Oh, okay, he's coming for you.
Yeah,
I have to go protect you."
Just trying to protect her in every way, and then her ending up being like, "No, I'm gonna protect you."
He kind of, I don't know, he was a dummy. He gave me kind of golden retriever husband vibes of he's a bit of a doofus. But in the end, I think he was very well-meaning, especially when you compare it to his really good friend.
Oh, 100%. He was a better husband than that guy.
Yeah.
Every way. That was another thing I saw that I forgot to bring up. The fact that when he walks into the room and his wife is laying there naked and dying, first off, he doesn't like shove Nosferatu off the bed.
True.
Try to cover his wife up and be like, "Oh, we should be ashamed. There's 2 other men with me and my wife is naked." He like lets her be there, like in her agency and her final form in the decision that she made. And he even closes her eyes and then just leaves her as she is, like sitting beside her, but still just allowing her to be who she is in that final moment and not trying to hide her or letting her be the heroine in the final moments and not being ashamed of that anymore. Yeah, there's a lot of beautiful things. Yeah, he's an idiot, but he also didn't know anything that was going on.
That's these people have no idea what's happening to them.
No, I don't blame him for being like, vampires aren't real. Fair enough. You didn't have Twilight to read.
You didn't know. No, that's so fair.
Yeah. So it was good. Also, there's a lot of things about Romani folklore and stuff in this. A lot of people have been criticizing the scenes with the Romanis, and I think that the director did a lot more research than people think. Like the scene with the horse and everything, that's a way that people actually hunted vampires. During that time period, it was like said that if you had a virgin on a horse at night, then the horse with the virgin wouldn't walk over the grave of a vampire. So that's how you could find the grave and then open it and destroy them. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff there too that you could look into a little bit more if you're interested. He tied a lot of history into this whole film.
He seems like a very good director. I've seen another movie that he did called The Northman. I don't know if you...
yeah, that's been popping up and I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it was a very intense movie, but I really liked it. And I think it's the same thing where it's like you could tell he did his research, but something that, because my husband loves his movies now too, of course.
Oh, yeah. I've seen The Witch.
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen The Witch yet, but I've seen
phenomenal. Also extremely feminist and unsettling. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But something that I guess the director has talked about in the past, that he wants to make sure that the characters are giving the reaction that they would like actually give to a situation if they were in that time and place, and not as if they were in like our world. And I think that's a really cool thing that you can see, like they are acting as if they're like upholding their own virtues, and if those people really existed in those times, that's what they would actually do. But yeah, at the same time, he still was able to make those subtle differences that made the heroine so much more an actual character and an actual person. Yeah, I think you just understand humanity really well with these
definitely
films.
No, it reminds me of, we were talking very recently also about Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives being written by the same author, and we're like, he just gets the female experience.
Yeah.
And I feel the same way about Robert Eggers. I'm like, you get it. You get it.
Mm-hmm.
So many people just don't get it, and he definitely does. He's one of those that I'm like, yeah, you understand.
It's a great job. Like I said, it felt funny almost to start January with a vampire episode, but man, after we saw that movie, and it takes place at Christmas time, I think, in the movie, doesn't it? There was like a nod. It said something about Christmas
something
time,
like that.
I was like, oh, that's why they released it at this time.
Yeah, it came out at Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
so,
yeah, it's a gothic horror. So
it's
like,
a gothic
it's not really
horror. Yeah.
It's different.
Totally.
I think in a lot of ways it's a fun way to start the year too, with like us, because our last episodes were like Halloween.
True.
And then to be like, we're starting, and then moving into everything, and just being able to talk about the duality of womanhood and humanity and everything.
Also, too, the horror genre just is laced with feminist themes
so much.
I love it.
It's recently become my absolute favorite genre because they aren't afraid to call out misogyny in all of its forms. Because, honestly, isn't that the most horrific thing that most of us will face?
Right. Valid.
We have to deal with that over and over again. It makes it feel more defeatable in a lot of ways, too.
Yeah.
Where it's, okay, I can't go and, like, stab someone. But at the end of the day, it feels a little bit more conquerable.
Totally.
Yeah. So,
it does.
Yeah, I've been really enjoying the horror genre.
Love feminist horror over here.
Yeah, it's very great.
Amazing. Thank you for joining us back again in our 2025. Thanks for remembering that we're still here, and thanks for allowing us to take that break that I think we both very much needed. But now we're feeling refreshed, ready for a whole 2025 of feminism and the arts and women, and finding that in the media the world has created, and also just old, lost and forgotten women artists that deserve some credit.
Definitely. We've got a full year lined up. March Madness coming up very soon. Quicker than any of us ever expect.
Truly.
And more just throughout the whole year. So yeah, thanks for listening. Don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, all of the above. Send this episode to someone that you feel would enjoy it. And we will be back next week.
We'll be back
with another episode.
Yeah, we will. Okay. Bye.